Yo, what's up, guys? I'm back with another video, and I wanted to talk briefly about more of my thoughts on cognitive type and visual identification for personality. I've been watching a lot of their videos and going back into some of the signals that correspond to the cognitive functions. So there are certain signals, for example, with TE that has this sassy head shaking thing going on, whatever you want to call it. As an example, or you guys, if you're familiar with cognitive type, you know the little distinctions that they use to figure out signals for typing and signals for type. And I'm kind of approaching this from a macro view in terms of seeing if there's a way that I could synthesize Socionics and cognitive type. And I know that Jack and Juan from CT had conversation about the plausibility of that happening. If it could happen, it was more Jack thinking of the possibility of integrating body mannerisms as a signal for psychological type, and how that would correspond to Socionics definitions of information, metabolism, elements, and all that kind of stuff. One thing that I have noticed is as I have knowledge in Socionics and CT, I'm not up to date with new and improved methods within CT for typing, but I guess I kind of hold to the more basic assumptions that I've learned in the past about CT and Vultology in general. And there are also other Vultological schools out there. There are even some in Socionics. And usually the other schools of thought, Vultological schools of thought, would just group a bunch of people together and that were allegedly the same type, and they would kind of draw comparisons between their physical appearance, and that would basically be a certain signals for type would basically be deduced from that pool of intertype physical similarities, right? So you have a bunch of people who are ENTP and they look like this, and then I go out and I type somebody and they're this type, and then I can pair my typing of them from their physical features and how it relates to other people in the photo album of ENTPs, for example. And one thing I have noticed is that the types that CT gives people in comparison to the types that Socionicists give people, and I'm talking about if they're doing a celebrity typing, for example, those are obviously the most objective kinds of, everyone's pulling from celebrities because everyone can research them and look them up. And albeit it's probably not the most in-depth data that you can draw from a celebrity interview, for example. But for example, I don't have access to the same pool of people that you do in your environment, in your bubble. And so I will say that the types that Socionicists usually agree on, in comparison to CT's database of typings, they're pretty similar. At the very least, you will get, if CT types someone an ESTP, for example, in their system, I've noticed that a lot of them will still be in the beta quadrant Socionics. And there's something very interesting, like when, and I'm kind of just thinking out loud and processing in the moment, but like what system has the most fundamentally accurate representation of what type someone is? You have, which includes a certain robust type description, which depends upon robust definitions that create that type. So if you have an ESTP, for example, you have the composite definition or type profile of ESTP, and then you have all the components that make an ESTP, namely the cognitive functions or IMEs in Socionics, or the signals in CT, or so on and so forth, right? And those, so you have macro considerations of what make an ESTP an ESTP, the kind of narrative aspect, like does their life correspond to this type description in some sense? It's the most superficial, and I mean that more in a neutral sense, not with a negative connotation, but it's the most generalized understanding of someone's personality, and then which that description, if the micro components of what make a type, namely the most fundamental aspects of the system, which are the cognitive functions or the IMEs or whatever, if those descriptions in and of themselves lack clarity and are general, then what they produce will be maximally general. If they're hyper-specific, then what they produce will be very specific, obviously. Relative to a type description versus cognitive function, there's obviously a chasm there. One's a more macro composite evaluation of the type, which is a general understanding by virtue of it being a type description. But if the fundamentals are tightly defined, then even the general composite description of the type is going to be tighter than other general type descriptions. And then in theory, the system that has a general but yet robust description of the type, I lost my train of thought. They will apply more specifically to the person in question. And additionally, everyone in that group should have very interrelated fundamental characteristics that distinguish them from another type. With a system that lacks specificity and distinction at the micro level, the type description they give will include anyone who relates with almost arbitrary distinctions in personality. For example, this person's aggressive, and therefore because they're aggressive, they funnel into this composite type. And so from that method of typing, I can probably deduce that the fundamentals in that system lack clarity, and they lack structure, they lack consistency, they lack categorical distinction. What makes this and not this other thing? But again, what's compelling with CT and Vultology in general is that irrespective if we use certain words that define a function, for example, even if you were to remove that, there's something about kinds of people that demonstrate their individuality, their distinctness, by the way that they're expressing themselves through hand gesturing, through eye toggling, or whatever the case is, through micro expressions, through the way they relate to their environment. Are they kind of an indirect feature of the environment? Are they passive towards occurrences around them, or are they do they have some type of centeredness in the present moment, or are they evading the present moment, right? And because our mind and our body have a necessary cooperation, it stands to reason that our personality, which is a composite of all the features of what make a person, their genetics, their brain structure, their cognitive activity, their interests, their hobbies, their values, their experience, their worldview, all of those considerations, that should express itself physically. It should demonstrate personality by the way that we engage with the world, and our primary way of engaging with the world is by being an active agent who animates and is, for example, can have a fear reaction to the environment, or an aggressive reaction. Just it's a kind of posture towards what happens in the environment. Do you retreat from it? Do you pull away from it? Do you criticize it? Are you open to it? Are you and again, the fundamental assumption within Jungian typology is that information that makes a personality exists within an individual's cognition. Not solely cognition, but the cognitive functions obviously are functions of the mind that are hardwired in a certain fashion that give you a distinctive personality type. And that's under all Jungian philosophy of personality. You have cognitive functions under Jungian personality philosophy, whatever you want to call it. So the cognitive functions, SCTE, these aren't aspects of information within reality in a general sense. This is information that almost derives from minds. And core socionics teaching may not hold to what I'm going to say here. I think it does, but maybe I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But the way that I've said this before, but the way that I've conceptualized information elements is in the literal sense. There are elements of information, there are bits of data that exist not only within us and private to us, but they exist by virtue of reality being reality existing, like things having existence. When you think about introverted logic and drawing logical distinctions between kinds of things and creating categories for those things, and using a category of communication, namely language, verbal articulation, in order to make distinction between a cat versus a dog, for example. That information exists necessarily because reality is encoded with the laws of logic, and that's accessible to everyone, right? And so this is where you kind of draw this chasm between a pan-Jungian approach to personality. It's a different philosophy to a certain degree. There are obvious relationships and connections and correlations, but it's a different approach to personality almost entirely, because there's fundamentally divergent claims. Obviously, they're pulling from the same origin of information, but their interpretation of that information is more distinctive than their superficial relationships. Namely, extroverted intuition exists in both socionics and the pan-Jungian understanding. That term is shared. And actually, the information, the content of that information is pretty seamless between both systems. However, its application, the further you get from that fundamental relationship they share, the divergences start to depend upon the rest of the system's claims in order to fully understand, for example, extroverted intuition. But there's always going to be competition in reality, even if it's personal or impersonal objects. If there is someone who is building their house and they keep adding on rooms to their house, then they're competing with space with the rest of the land. There could be trees growing there, or there could be animals in that environment, and the presence of a competitor, whether it's an impersonal object or a personal object, sentient or inanimate object, there is a displacement of space by virtue of an entity of greater volume, and that doesn't have to be a person doing that. It doesn't have to be a cognitive thinking person that's understanding that information and metabolizing it and demonstrating it for that information to have application irrespective of any person's doing it. You see the Earth revolve and orbit around the sun. You see the sun locking the Earth into orbit because it has a greater mass, and its pull on the Earth is greater because of its mass. That is a demonstration of extroverted sensation, information of extroverted sensation and introverted sensation. There are distinctive features between the sun and the moon. Their relative temperatures, their mass, their density, their how fast they're spinning, I would imagine. I don't know all this stuff, but I'm kind of just thinking out loud here. And those distinctions are logical distinctions. Those are informed logic-oriented distinctions of information about two things. That's how we know the difference between the sun and the moon. And so my point in bringing that up is all of those facts. Now, you could get really philosophical here, right? Because I could imagine someone would say that you wouldn't be able to say anything rational or logical about things if you didn't exist. If there were no minds on Earth, there would be no logical distinction between things. And I think that there's a difference between saying that there is a distinction, a logical distinction between, for example, the sun and the moon, and my ability to articulate that fact. It would still be a fact that the Earth would revolve around or orbit around the sun if there were no people to perceive it. Now, someone could say that distinction is arbitrary because no one can see it. And I would say that's begging the question. I don't think that it's arbitrary. It's very relevant for the Earth's survival that it is fixed in its positions so that it doesn't overheat or it doesn't turn ice cold, and there's no habitable life on it regardless. So the fact would still be a fact that the Earth is orbiting around the sun, regardless of if anyone can understand that or perceive that. That's not saying anything to the fact of the case. It would still be true that it happened or that it is happening. And you could get into real deep. It's a good question though. And another little added point is that the truthfulness of that fact demonstrates itself, and by it demonstrating itself, it has certain effects that are generated from that fact. It is a fact because there could be planets that are, if they get too close to the sun, they'll burn, and that has happened. And so the fact doesn't need a mind to apprehend it for it to be a fact. It just has to occur. That's what makes a fact a fact. It has to actually happen. And that's kind of the difference between, it gets epistemological there. Basically, do minds have to perceive something that is true for that thing to be true? And I would say, no, I don't think that's true. I think that's a conflation. But yeah, what else was I going to say? That would be different if someone asked you about a fact, random fact that you don't have the tools to determine its factualness. It's not a question of, can you know this to be a fact? It's a question of, is it a fact? Which those aren't the same things. But so, as a little side tangent, but I've thought about, and also, it's just funny because and I've gone through the definitions of CT, SE, and I've been typed as SETI, but SEFE, conscious, and CT. And it is funny because there was one video while I was talking about the difference in the approach to information between SE and NE, and SE becomes hyper fixated upon parts of a whole, basically. And they will systematically work through each part and kind of arrive at a composite understanding of the thing from beginning to end. Just so far as it still captures their attention, they're still a PE type. So if something lacks a kind of informational hold on them or grip on them, then they don't, being a PE lead, they will look something else. And you can kind of imagine an SE type, jumping around doing the PE thing, but when they're jumping, they're just hyper fixated upon a very minute aspect of a system of thought. And I mean, for myself, I would say that's fairly accurate. And I think SE, in regards to information, will grab what is most substantial about those things. What's most fundamental about those things, what's most essential about those things, whereas I feel like NE is even more divergent in the realm of PE than an SE type would be, because from a CT understanding, they lack that kind of bodily presence and groundedness, which causes them behaviorally and psychologically to be in this conceptual idea hopping. And I think the inverse of what I said about SE could apply to NE in CT, obviously, that NE seems to grab the most superficial aspects of ideas or interests, and almost necessarily so, because if they're psychologically divergent and hopping across interests and they're not rooted in the present, then it follows that the things that they would actually grab would be something that would be fleeting, or it would be something that is momentary. It is here today and gone tomorrow. And so your relationship to that idea or that event or that thing that you're chasing as an any person would have to be something insubstantial. And it's insubstantial, obviously, because they're also an intuitor. If they're intuitive, they're not really grasping concrete things. They're not really focusing on concrete things. They're basically diverting and diverging from reality into theoretical imaginations of alternative realities, right? And so by every measure of personality and psychology, they're not here, right? Even when they're here, they're in a character. They're and I've seen this happen. And I will say, to kind of grab that fact within the system of CT and relate it to Socionics, those are, it gives you an upper hand when you know both systems, or you know multiple systems, and you know them well enough to know how the types in CT or OPS or how it would come out, how that kind of information would pass through the system, different systems. And obviously using the definitions of that taxonomy in order to do that, not just saying you're ENTP here, so you're that there, and all this stuff, whatever. But every part of an NE lead would be not grounded, and almost necessarily so. Their word choice, their lexicon, the way that they portray themselves or demonstrate themselves to the world is through a character, is through an alternative them. And if you want to play the game with them, you can't be you. You have to be something other than you. And again, the way I'm articulating this is it's kind of exaggerated, but because it proves the point. I think it's mostly true, and it's kind of funny to me. So I'm kind of saying this a little bit in jest, but I think it's true. And so theoretically, you don't know the who that you're talking to. And so there's a kind of levity within any types that, and I'm saying this I'm saying this for like an any lead because that really exemplifies the expression of any because it's the lead. So it's the strongest, most conscious, whatever you want to call it. There would be a lack of seriousness, right? There would be and you could really think of any, probably in every system, as the least serious function. Seriousness, the term, kind of assumes that there's a here and now understanding, a concreteness, a resoluteness, a sober-mindedness that only really can come from someone grounded, someone understanding the situation, and it also kind of implies a lack of jovialness and playfulness. And invertedly, you could say the opposite about NE, that they are jovial and that they lack seriousness because there is a psychological escapism that manifests in the mind of a NE lead, for example. And just the way that CT has articulated the functions from a Jungian philosophy of information and personality, I find it pretty interesting. And it makes sense that, like, for example, the SI and NE relationship, that if an SI lead is always going to have an undercurrent relationship to their NE. And I would imagine because there is if it's conscious, then you would see, in theory, more expression of extrovert intuition if you're an SI lead in CT. But I think in all systems, there is between the poles, between in Socionics, the leading and the suggestive, and Jungian understanding, the first and the fourth function, that there is the presence of the fourth, or the suggestive, or the whatever you want to call it. And with an SI person, you can kind of see it work through them. And the last video I watched was kind of interesting. With SI leads that Mom was talking about, they have the levity of any that's kind of making them physically buoyant and kind of moving around, but they're always kind of anchoring back to center mass, and it's kind of this delayed movement. Now that's obviously exaggerated. I'm not SI, so I don't do that. But and the body mechanics of an SE, in contrast to that, would be this strong center of gravity that is probably going to be moving around because they're extroverted, and they're going to be almost, even if they're not touching other things, they're going to be aware of the things happening around them. And they will potentially just move towards the object that's capturing your attention, or lock onto that optically and kind of narrow in on that thing and examine that thing and look at it and play with it and all that kind of stuff. But and you can see this stuff, and that's what I'm interested in. I mean, I've thought about people in my life, and I can see the signals in my mind that they do consistently. And if I know what category of expression that fits into, I can for sure know with a high degree of certainty, at least in CT, that they're on this axis, TEFI, for example. And it's a game, right? Then I know that's for sure, because if it wasn't, then I would get mixed signaling, or they just wouldn't be doing that. And we're assuming, yes, that CT's way of capturing the type, of getting the type, I think is still pretty accurate. Like, there's definitely areas where there's probably a dissonance between body mannerisms and potentially a conflation between body mannerisms and personality type, because I would have to research that, but body mannerisms and way of expressing could be hyper environmentally generated and produced. And if that's the case, then you'd basically be saying not that the person in question is the type that you think they are, but maybe their parent is. Maybe the parent they were closer with, that they have very similar mannerisms to that person because they were closer, and therefore it may seem that they're that type, but in fact they're not. Or you could say that there's kinds of body mannerisms and microexpressions that are genetically produced, aka they're basically a more essential and person relative expression of psychology or body mannerisms, and then there's other aspects of body mannerisms that are superficial, for example, and anyone could emulate if they were in the same surrounding. And if that's the case, then you claim that personality is primarily environmentally produced rather than genetically produced. And then if it's not genetically produced, then personality is fluid. And in theory, there isn't any essential distinction between anybody else. It's a distinction between experience and environment. And yeah, I'm not quite sure. I'm not really sure how much, like, how body mannerisms and expression, all that kind of stuff are. And also, I'll hopefully keep that point and move something else, or come back to it. But let's say that if it were true that body mannerisms and Vultology is just an environmental factor, or hold on, let's back up. If personality was kind of genetic, and I lean more towards that, there's some truth and essential feature of people, their personality is distinct from other people's personality, even though they might share personality with someone else, but they're still distinct people. And that answers the question between why do you find these differences? But you should find more overlap, psychologically speaking. But if you were to place them in that environment where there's a strong character in the household that has very distinctive mannerisms, and would you still be doing what you naturally do in terms of body mannerisms if you were in that environment for a long period of time? And if the answer to that is no, you wouldn't be doing that over time, then that seems to suggest that personality is more person relative, and that it is something that is very innate for you. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. But I'm kind of getting off track. But I can see people that I know and think of them and recall their body mannerisms, their signals for their type in Vultology. I know that I can see that. I've watched dozens of videos, and I can see what they're doing, and I remember that, and I relate it to other people that I know. And I'm like, you're doing this thing that's the same, so you must share this information, right? That's doing CT functionally the right way, right? Of course, it would have to be that. I mean, obviously, the more a true Vultologist will go through all the signals, and of course, but if someone's repeating signals constantly and you can see it and it's all the time, then at the very least, you should be able to nail that part of it. And so I can see this. Now, the question is, does that signal correspond to the definition of what that signal demonstrates, what that signal is implying? If it's yes, then we got something cooking. We're like, okay, you are that type in this system. I know that I can see that. You're this type in this system, Okay, how do you relate to Socionics or some tightly defined system? How do you come out as in there? And I would be using that taxonomy while aware of CT's taxonomy, and then temporarily just bookmark that as a fact. You're this type, that's what it is. And then do Socionics to them, right? And you're kind of cooking, and you're like, okay, so you're this type here, and you're this type there. What is the relationship between those respective type descriptions? Is there continuity? Is there dissonance? Obviously, there is dissonance to a certain extent because they're different systems, but generally there should be something that crosses over. There should be something that will cross over, and then you take two people that are the same type in CT, for example. You type one of them in Socionics, and you type the other one, and then you draw that comparison, and you're like, And there's other factors, right? There's enneagrammers, and so there's so many things happening, and so many combinations of people that's interesting, and that's just interesting. But I'll probably the next video I was going to talk about SI polar in Socionics and how it relates to EIE, just because I thought about it out of the blue. We'll see, but I wanted to just get on here and just kind of process some of the things I was thinking about. And let me know what you guys think. Peace.